Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, your RB Laws, and this is my co-host.
For Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. We stopped numbering our episodes a while back to prevent some formatting issues, but this is our 100th episode. So thank you all to all the viewers, and supporters who have been there every step of the way, every video, every like. It all helps. We wouldn't be able to do this stuff without you. And before we get started with this episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and X at the OBT podcast for more updates and short form content. And TikTok. Sorry, same at.
Yes. Yes. So welcome to episode 100. This one is probably going to be mainly focused on, I guess the trade market, because obviously December 15th has already passed, right? And that's kind of the first major trade date in the NBA where, a decent chunk of contracts can be traded. So I believe the way that it's normally structured is December 15th normally. So players that have signed new contracts, like, with new teams, or players that have signed, re-signed with their previous teams, but, it's not a raise. That's December 15th. And then January 15th is players that have, signed contracts that are raises, bird rights and whatnot. Or if they signed an extension like really, really late, I think for some guys, if they have like 1 year left on their deals. So we still have another month or so before, like almost anybody can basically be traded aside
Yeah.
from, however many people it is. Um, but still, it's kind of important to talk about it now, as the season is kind of, in full swing. And now we're kind of getting a better sense of, who, is in what category, right, in terms of buyers and sellers. I guess before, we get into it, I just wanted to, just shout out a comment from the previous video, Justin Bradley dash EE10M, and he mentioned Draymond is a clown, right? So, just wanted to shout him out. And yeah, that was definitely clownish
Yeah.
behavior.
He's not wrong.
Yeah, he's not definitely not wrong there. So, just wanted to shout him out.
Yeah.
We're gonna start doing that, for people, who leave comments in the videos. Since
Yeah.
we talk about, leave comments and like and subscribe, we also want to kind of, give back.
Yeah.
So, um, but now, I guess we'll kind of get into the nitty gritty. So,
Sure.
pretty much, I guess what we're gonna do for this one is we're gonna kind of look at. We picked 5 teams each, and basically kind of, picked like a handful of teams, which could be buyers, could be sellers, and then just kind of like have like an overlook at their roster and what they should probably do. So, I think the first one that I'm gonna try to start with, is I'm gonna go with the Cleveland Cavaliers.
Okay.
So
It's an
this
interesting one.
team is kind of, intriguing in terms of what are they going to do, right? So they sit 14 and 12. They're currently 8th in the Eastern Conference. Unfortunately, they just got hit with, 2 really major injuries, right? So Darius Garland, well, the first one was, the first one was Darius Garland, where he got a fractured jaw
Yeah.
that's going to keep him out for at least, they said several weeks, so they don't have like an exact timetable yet, but obviously several weeks. That
Yeah.
means basically he's going to be out probably at least a month.
Right.
And even when he comes back, who knows like how long that will take, right? I would assume he'd have to wear some type of mask or something,
Yeah.
maybe. Um, I think he actually finished the game or something that he played in, but
Mm-hmm.
I guess he finished it with a
With the
fractured jaw,
yeah.
which is wild. But then also Evan Mobley, he had already been out for a while, due to a knee injury, but I guess unfortunately the injury was serious enough that he needed to have arthroscopic surgery. So
Right.
that's going to put him out now for 6 to 8 weeks. So now you're going to have basically, at least a month plus stretch, where you're going to be with, without 2 of your 3 best players, and one of which is, like one of your best defensive guys. So that's definitely rough. Um, in their first game, they did blow out the Hawks, right? Who haven't, been very good. They've also got some injury issues of their own as well. So I'm curious to see what Cleveland does over the course of this stretch. And I think how they, perform in this stretch will kind of go a long way into figuring out what they're going to do, right? Because if they can kind of just, hang on, tight and just kind of, just maintain, right, then maybe they'll look to probably, just maybe add, or maybe tweak a few pieces to the roster. But if they kind of struggle and they slide a little bit, then I do kind of wonder, is that kind of a situation where maybe they make some changes, right? I'm not saying that they're going to trade Donovan Mitchell or anything. I'm not saying that, but it could be a scenario where they might feel, like they're under some pressure to make some major moves, right? We already know like a guy like a Jared Allen, maybe he could be, on the trade block. Obviously, a guy like a Karis LeVert or an Isaac Okoro, right? I mean, when you look at their schedule, I mean, it's kind of mixed, I guess, right? They play teams like the Rockets, they play, Also like the Jazz, the Pelicans, the Bulls, but also like the Mavs, the Bucks, a couple games against the Wizards and the Spurs, right? So overall, the schedule isn't too crazy,
Right.
right? But at the same time, when you're missing guys, right, it makes it harder to kind of pull out, wins, right? We've seen that, as of late from some teams. So I mean, I'm assuming right now they're going in with the mindset of like it's been a rough season, but like we're still probably gonna try to see what we can do. Going in. So my guess is that, like I said, I think they'll probably be some type of like in between, like where it's like they're gonna try to buy, but it's more so gonna be like they're gonna maybe swap out some guys. And
Okay.
like I said, that's where I think, can you maybe see if you can figure out, what you can do with that big man situation. Obviously, now Jared Allen, you don't have the floor spacing issue now, right? Because now instead of just, instead of having Evan Mobley and Allen out there, right? Now it's just Allen, and I guess what is it like? Usually like Dean Wade,
Mm-hmm.
right, or like Georges Niang, right? So
Yeah.
they're not really running, like Tristan Thompson's the backup center, right? He's not starting next to Allen, so it's not quite as dire, right? But obviously, you also got to approach it like, when these guys are healthy and come back. How do we handle that? So maybe I don't I don't know. I don't know if they're gonna trade Jared Allen just because again, right now you don't want to because again, he's your only, true center right now. Um so outside of that, right, I would probably say most likely it's probably gonna be, one of those other guys, right? Maybe like a Levert, or somebody like that, right? I guess Okoro, he's kind of starting right now. I guess, where they have Mitchell kind of running point guard. And that's probably kind of where it'll be intriguing to see how they run it, right? Because it's like now you don't have as many like tiny guys in the lineup. Right now you don't have two small guards, surrounded by two non-shooting bigs. Now you have, Mitchell as a point guard who's not quite as small. Then you have, I guess Okoro as like a two, and then you have Strus as a three. And I guess they're kind of interchangeable. Then you have whoever at the four, and then Allen at the five. So that
Right.
could kind of be something intriguing they go with. I know there was like a weird thing about the Bulls reaching out to see like, hey, will you give us Darius Garland
Yeah, I
for
heard
Zach
about that.
LaVine? I don't know what that was about.
Yeah,
I
that would be stupid,
Yeah, I don't think
honestly.
Cleveland. Yeah, I don't think Cleveland would do that.
No.
But that's what I'm looking at. Where like I still feel like this should be a stretch where I think they should be able to win enough games to where like their season isn't going to be completely over, just because they have some winnable matchups. But again, you know, if it drops, right, and then they start losing games, then it could get rough. But at the same time, like because of their record, like and where the teams below them are, other than Brooklyn, like I don't see them all of a sudden dropping from like 8 to, like 12 or something like that, where
Right.
it's like, okay, now the season is over. Like they're probably just gonna stay in that play-in range and then see like, hey, if we can get healthy, maybe we can add some. So I guess I'll kind of say fire, but like a little bit reluctantly, where I feel like again, there is a doomsday scenario where they could start moving some guys, but I don't think that's going to happen. I feel like they'll probably just try to stay, afloat and then see what they can go from there.
Yeah, I agree. They're not on my list, but they're for sure, I think, a buyer, with the injuries that have recently transpired. And, they have some young talent, but I just don't think that those guys are necessarily quote unquote NBA ready at times. Craig Porter looks decent sometimes, but Bates is more on like that two-way kind of deal. So they do need some other guys that will help. I think Okoro's been underwhelming. So it wouldn't surprise me, like you said, because they are kind of in that in between spot where they could easily, get rid of Okoro and then, bring in somebody else who could, bolster up the roster a little bit more, especially since Garland's going to be missing at least a month, like you were saying, and then um, Mobley's going to be out for 6 to 8 weeks. Prayers on that. But I mean, geez, like Cleveland's season this year has been really disappointing, underwhelming. They got hit with the injury bug multiple times, so I think they definitely are a team that needs to look to improve and find some guys as we get closer to the deadline because I think that's the key to success. Because like you said, they're falling fast. They need to stay afloat, like you literally just said. They need to stay in this race if they don't want to waste Donovan Mitchell's years, because I think that's the biggest thing is they want to keep Donovan Mitchell happy. You don't want to have given up a decent amount to get him. And then, he just kind of bails on you. It is only
Right.
year two of this situation, but I think, they need to play the long game here. And I think the best thing to do with that would maybe give up some unproductive guys, or maybe some productive guys where you could get something even better for that person. So it's hard though with Cleveland because it's kind of slim pickings at times. The roster isn't great. I don't think they're one of the deeper rosters. I think they are one of the better starting fives. Not statistically, but on paper, I do kind of like some of the guys. But the bench, I'm not too happy with some of the guys. They're just not. I don't think NBA not caliber guys, but just people who I don't think should be getting a immense amount of minutes on this roster. So they're in a tough spot for me, but I do agree they should definitely be buyers. Yeah, so oddly enough, you mentioned the Zach LaVine rumor. So yeah, my team is obviously the Bulls. I think this is one that everybody who covers the NBA would have them for sure as a seller. They're trying to, I think, blow it up at this point. We've heard the rumors for the past month or so, about Zach LaVine, Caruso, DeRozan. It's been a nightmare for this core. Albeit, they haven't really been healthy in terms of having Lonzo Ball. That's really unfortunate because when Lonzo was there, it was great basketball. It was really fun to watch. But now the question is, okay, now we're just wasting money, people's years, and a lot of talent. So I think, it's time for them to move on from some stuff. So like I said, I think the three main assets that they definitely have to move on from, for sure, Zach LaVine. I think that's number one priority for sure because there's a lot of money on the table. And I know there hasn't been, too big of a market for him, which is wild to think about. I feel like if it was a few years ago, yeah, we'd be talking about a completely different scenario. But nonetheless, the guy hasn't really been that efficient, hasn't been that great. Although, it is kind of weird. I've heard that the Lakers are like one of the bigger suitors out there. I think that's the rumor that has the most noise. But honestly, D'Lo and Zach LaVine aren't too far from each other in terms of the play this season. The efficiency is weird from both of those guys, actually. So I'm not sure if the Lakers should even really entertain that at all. Because, I mean, if you think about it, LaVine's not a great defender. D'Lo's not a great defender. So it's like you're just basically getting a more expensive, more athletic D'Lo, I guess is what you could call it. Because, I mean, LaVine is not a defender. 4 years max money. It's just weird. I don't know. So I just don't think that LaVine is that kind of like favorable, especially in this NBA meta. I guess that's like the best way to put it, because his archetype is like scorer, athletic, can shoot at times. Because like we know he can be streaky. Like I think he's already put up a 50-point game this season, but he's not having the best year, especially with Kobe White, coming in ever since LaVine has been hurt. That's the biggest thing is LaVine's been hurt. And Kobe White, I think, has been putting up like 27, 26 points in like the last 7 or 8 games, earning less money than LaVine. So it's like, I know Kobe White probably isn't like, the whole future and stuff, but I mean, he's cheap. So why not just keep him? Because he's been on a hot streak. So I think that's the issue with LaVine. And then moving on to like Alex Caruso, I think almost everybody in the NBA could probably use him, especially the contenders. So I think that's a big draw. I think the priority, like I said, should be LaVine, but the biggest draw for sure is going to be Alex Caruso. I think we know that. He has the LeBron cosign. That's kind of all you need. He's got that Chetty Osman effect where it's like, he can be really good, high IQ player, can shoot sometimes. I think he's even hit a game winner this year. Defender, I'm not going to say all NBA defender, but he's a gritty defender.
He was last year.
Yeah, so it's like he's a gritty defender. So I think he has so much to offer in terms of his role because I think he's a solidified role player that can bring so many things to the game of basketball. And then DeRozan, I think, is probably one of those guys where I'm not going to say it's like a high risk, high reward, but it's weird because I think the extension stuff doesn't help. The matching the money is a little tricky, I think. And his play style doesn't help as much, but I think, the name and the draw, it is kind of interesting because I think, there are some teams that could potentially be interested in that, because I don't know. It's weird because I'm not sure what his salary is. I think it's around like 28 million or something like that. So who's going to really match that for him? And who would you be giving up? I have heard like the Heat and stuff, like with Kyle Lowry, but I just don't know if the Bulls are willing to do that. That's not a great return, in my opinion. I feel like they'd have to add something else in there. So I think DeRozan is tricky. Not as tricky as LaVine, but it's still rough. And then, there are some other guys in there as well, like Javon Carter for sure. I guess Andre Drummond as well, and then Vucevic, but I don't know. I think the main 3 guys that they should look to sell for sure would be LaVine, Caruso, and DeMar DeRozan because you're probably going to get the most back for those three guys.
Yeah, I think I'm definitely with you there because again, like those are the main guys that have been in trade rumors, right? We haven't heard as much about like Vucevic,
Yeah.
or some of the other guys you mentioned, right, being in trade rumors like a Carter, because I think the guys because I don't think the Bulls are going to completely blow it up, but I feel like at least one of those guys I think is going to be gone.
Sure.
There's a lot of noise and like you said in terms of with Levine in regards to the Lakers wanting him, but then there's also a lot of noise about how there's not a lot of like interest in him from a trade
Mm-hmm.
standpoint. And like you said, I think a lot of that stems from his contract, combined with just what he is as a player, right?
Right.
Because like if he was on his previous contract where he's not at 40 million a year, right? Then like you said, I think that's where a lot more teams would be interested. But
Mm-hmm.
when you're making that much money, is he that much of a floor raiser? Because then that means, like you said, you have to give up a lot. Because, like you said, with say the Lakers, it's not just D'Angelo Russell. You'd have to add a couple other guys in
Yeah.
there, right? You have to throw in like a Rui Hachimura, right? And then you'd probably have to throw in, at least one other, like small contract,
Mm-hmm.
you know, just to make it work. I'm gonna assume they'd have to maybe throw in some type of pick, maybe a second. I don't,
Yeah.
something like that. And is that? Do you feel like that's not you, but like if you're the Lakers, like, do you feel like that's enough of an upgrade, to put you in a better spot? Like, I feel like
No.
you're looking for something else. You know what I mean? Where it's like, because I think like
Multi-dimensional player. I feel like
right.
Levine's too one-dimensional.
Yeah, exactly. For the money,
Right.
right? And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
not like you're giving up like one guy and then swapping them with another guy. You have to give out multiple players.
Right.
So I think it's more likely like a DeRozan or a Caruso gets moved. I know there's a lot of noise, about the idea of like the Bulls don't want to just move on from Caruso, which again, like he's played well for them,
Yeah.
right? So like you don't want to necessarily like just completely give up a guy like that. Um, and DeRozan, you wonder he could be another guy where I think he could be more likely than Levine just because he's in the last year of his deal. It doesn't seem like there's any, path towards an extension. And if that's the case, right, then that's where he could probably go somewhere. And I think the interesting thing with DeRozan is like, when you look at his numbers this year, they look a little down. I mean, like some of that obviously is, I guess, due to age. The efficiency's down, but the funny thing is like part of the efficiency thing is he's actually taking more threes. Right now, he's taking about a little under three threes a game, which isn't a
Right.
crazy amount, right? But he's been a guy that's typically not taken much more than like one or two the last few years. Um, and he's up to about 37% on threes, right? So now our team's going to guard him from three like he's like a, 37% three-point shooter. I don't know about that, but
Right.
at the same time, if he's improved a little bit as a three-point shooter, and again, he's always been a very good free throw shooter and mid-range guy. So if he's improved as a three-point shooter, that could make him a little bit more valuable to a number of teams. He's still not like a great defender, or like a rebounder or anything, right? Like the last few years, he spent time at the four. Um, but I guess this he's probably playing a little more three now just because of like who they have there
Right.
since guys been out. But I do think like he could definitely provide something to a team if his 3-point shooting is kind of legit. Because if that's the case, then he can really help a team. And then he's sliding into not as primary of a role.
Yeah.
He can still pass and play make pretty well. But again, like he's always been a guy where it's like, come playoff time, I'm not necessarily sure. Um, where it feels like he drops a little bit, and that's because he's not a great 3-point shooter. But if the three is there, that could help. And then, like you said, some of the other guys like an Andre Drummond, he's like a cheap option as a backup big man, right? So like a lot of teams could probably, say to themselves, yeah, we could use like a backup big man like a Drummond or something, right? Because the free agency market, not really anybody there, right? There's no options really there. So you're better off if you're a team that feels like you need a backup center, go trade for one, as opposed to just signing one. Just
Yeah.
because and who's out there. So I think, in terms of like most likely, probably like, whichever order you feel like between DeRozan slash Caruso and then Levine is third. Um, Maybe you could even put Drummond ahead of Levine just because he's so easy to trade. Just because his contract is so minuscule. So I definitely think the Bulls are a team that if they're looking to make trades, it's gonna be some type of seller thing, right? I know there's
Yeah.
been like a couple rumors about the idea of like, no, they actually want to add to their roster, and I'm like, add to what?
Yeah. There ain't nothing there to add to.
Right. So, I mean, they're 10 and 17, they're 12th in the East, and that's with them playing, much better as of late.
Yeah.
Um, because again,
Without Levine.
without Levine, they've been playing, a little better. So that's also kind of an interesting, scenario there. But I mean, it's definitely a team to watch because I don't see a version of this team that's good. So I just feel like at the very least with DeRozan, that's the guy that I think you should at least try to move just because of his contract. You could probably get something out of it, right?
Yeah.
Like Caruso, it's probably more so going to be like a pick or something, and then like a cheaper contract because he just doesn't make a whole lot. But DeRozan,
Hmm.
you might be able to be like, oh, somebody could throw in like a second, and then maybe throw in like a couple of like decent-ish players, maybe
Right.
not great, but like something. Um,
For sure.
so yeah, that's what I'm thinking. I think Levine. I feel like it's gonna be hard to move him
Yeah.
just because
That's what I was saying. I think
yeah,
that should be the priority though, just because of the contract. It's rough, but I do understand the difficulty for sure.
right. And then moving on to my next team. I think this is a team that we've talked about many times. So I think this one is kind of obvious, and that's the Warriors.
Okay.
Um, they're a team that I think is gonna try to be a buyer. I don't think they're gonna be a quote unquote seller and blow it up.
Right.
Um, we've already talked about them this year, right? Where they've not been very good. They're currently 11 and 14, right? They got to win the other night against, the Brooklyn Nets. They're currently playing the Blazers. Looks like they're probably going to win that one, so they'll get back to probably 12 and 14. But also, like, they're in an easier part of their schedule, so they're probably going to pick up wins anyway. We know a number of guys had been struggling for a while. They made some major changes where they moved some guys to the bench, right? Like Wiggins moved to the bench. Pajemski moved in as a starter. Kaminga's moved in as a starter, right? We obviously know what happened with the Draymond situation. Um, so there's a decent amount of options here in terms of like, the direction they could go in. I already mentioned, I just don't feel like they're going to trade any of the core guys. Even like a guy like Clay, he's been playing better the last few games. So I think like he's probably and like he wasn't getting benched. So you know what I mean? Like he could get benched like maybe at the end of games, but he wasn't going to get taken out of the lineup. And he's in a contract year. So I feel like he's probably safe on this team. I could be wrong. I know we have the back and forth, not you and I, but like, there's been back and forth conversations about like, is he done? Is he cooked? Or is he just not quite what he used to be? He's not shot the ball well this year, obviously, but the last few games he's been, way better. He had, 30 against the Clippers. He had 24 against the Nets, right? Shooting like, well over 40 from three, basically like 45 ish from the field. So I think now you're kind of getting a better version of Clay. Um, Wiggins the last couple of games I think has been like a little better, but also the bar was like subterraneanly low.
Yeah.
Um, so I think in terms of like what they're probably going to do, I still feel like it's probably going to be some combination of like either Chris Paul or like, some of the young players cuz like I said, I just don't think they're going to give up, on that core group. I think they're just going to be like let's just hope these guys play better. Clay's been playing better. Um and then, maybe we can find a way to get like some more size in that front court because I think they definitely need that. I don't think they can go in, to the playoffs with your only big options being Kevon Looney, who's not been as good this year, and Dario Saric, who's been good offensively, right? But again, there's going to be certain matchups where he's not going to help you,
Right.
at least on the defensive end. So just having that other option, I think, could help. Um, and then also like can you find a way maybe to get like another forward in there, right? So that way when you go smaller, right? So like let's say when you have those Draymond at the five lineups, right? Could you get two forwards out there? Because again, even with Kaminga, he's been playing better as of late. But again, I just feel like he's still kind of a hit or miss guy, and I just feel like come playoff time, I'm still not buying that he's gonna be like a game changer for them. So, I think that that's probably what they should look for, and I think they're going to try to, right? Woj has already talked about tons of teams have been calling them because I think they have players that, like, if they don't value the young guys that much, like, there are other teams that I think will, gladly take those guys and give them something back. Um, and again, like, they have to do something, right? Because they've been struggling for most of the year. You have a guy in Steph who's been playing great. And they're not just gonna like throw the season away. I don't even think they have their own pick, so like there'd be
No.
no point, in tanking. I think it goes to Portland, because it was traded, I think, to Memphis, way back with that Iguodala trade when they sent him to Memphis, I think, um, and then I think Memphis moved it over to Boston, and then I think it moved over to Portland, back in that Marcus Smart and the
Right.
Drew Holiday trade. So Portland has their pick, so there's no point in tanking. So I think they're going to be very active, in the trade market. And it'll be interesting to see, what the front office does, right? Because it's no longer, Bob Myers now. It's Mike Dunleavy Jr., right, who's running the front office. And again, he's made, his main moves that he did last offseason, right? He got them Chris Paul, and he drafted, the two rookies who have been, pretty solid. So, I think there's at the very least a okay benchmark, but the team also just hasn't been that great. So I think now we're getting a chance to see, like, what is his approach, to the season? Because, Bob Myers typically didn't really make trade deadline moves. He
Mm-mm.
only made a couple, I think. He did the one where they got Andrew Wiggins, the year where they were just, completely out of it and they were tanking.
Yeah.
And last year he did the one where it was Wiseman for Gary Payton.
Yeah.
So,
And
um,
he's just so invested with that core, or he was invested. Bob Myers, he was so invested with Curry, Clay, Dre, those guys. So I get it, but like I feel like with Dunleavy, it might be a completely different story because how invested is he in the core? Is he willing to keep it together? Does he, because I know there's a huge sentiment like people really love Clay, and I think we're in that boat where it's like we want to see him succeed, and we know he's going to go down as one of the greatest Warriors of all time, contributed to all those rings, but the play has not been great, through the season. There are times like you said where he does look good, but then there's other times where it's like, okay, does this guy really still have it or not? So I do understand like people saying that he won't get traded, but I just don't. I'm just not willing to rule out the possibility. You know what I mean?
yeah, because you just don't know. Because,
Yeah.
like, even last year, right, he looked honestly probably worse than he did at the beginning of this season.
Yeah.
And then, he had the stretch from January onwards where he was great. And then all of a sudden, once you got back to the playoffs, then it just kind of felt like, now he's struggling all over again.
Right.
And I feel like some of that is just like that's probably just what it's going to be like at this point, right? Especially, now teams have more size to put on them, teams are more athletic. So, I think it's just going to be a little bit more of a struggle for him depending on the matchup, right?
Yeah.
But
Agreed.
still, it's like, you just never know. He can still always have, the games where he's, just is a flamethrower. And, when he's playing well, that gives, that makes Golden State a lot better, So, like, at the very least, we can say, well, if Clay and Wiggins start playing better, in their new-ish roles, well, I guess Clay's role isn't really any different because he's still starting. But if they're
Right.
playing better, that will make the team better. But is it still going to be better enough where we feel like it's a championship team? My thought process is probably not. So I think that that's where I'm like, I think they're going to be pretty active in the trade market. It's just a matter of, what are they willing to give up? And then what are the other teams willing to give back? Which kind of sounds obvious, but really to me that is what it is like at this point because
Sure. I get it.
it's all hands on deck where you don't have much time with this group left anyways. Because Steph, as great as he's been playing, he is 35. So how many more elite seasons are you going to get out of him? He's only missed a couple of games, so he's been pretty healthy. And that's the other factor, right? Where it's like, if he goes down, then obviously that's a problem.
Right.
Um, but either way, like I said, they're gonna be a buyer. Like I don't know, specifically like what guys would be great. I know some people have mentioned obviously stars, right? Like Siakam, Markkinen, right? But again, if you're gonna do that, right, like you're probably gonna have to give up a little bit more. But like I don't know, like is Utah gonna be willing to give up Laurie Markkinen for like Chris Paul
N-
or something like that?
No.
Like
No.
I don't.
No.
I think Laurie Markkinen's contract isn't that big. Because
But
when
he's
you
so
sign,
good though.
yeah, exactly, and that's the thing. But it's also like he's really good, but his contract is kind of inexpensive. So it's like if a team wants him, they don't have to give up a lot, right? He makes
Right.
like I think he's making about 18 million this year,
Right.
right? So you don't. So
That's a
that could be a
steal.
scenario where like, oh, well, we could give up like Moody, Kaminga, and then maybe like one more guy that we don't really care about,
But
and then
I don't
pick.
think Utah's gonna go for that though. I don't
Yeah,
know.
yeah, because that's the problem. And then like a Siakam, right? Obviously, he makes way more money, right? So that would have to be, where you decide to do like the Chris Paul type contract, right?
Right.
Because he's like that 30 plus, $1 million range, because he, got like a big payday,
Right.
got his other contract. So I mean, yeah, he's making 37, 38 million. So that's a scenario where you're gonna have to add in more guys. So I mean, I don't know. Do you feel like that they need to make a major trade, or do you think it's more so like on the margins where it's like maybe we can swap a couple, like few like smaller contract guys out, and then we'll just be better, and then just hope that Clay and Wiggins are better, or do you think like it's got to be like a major shakeup?
Got to be a major one. I think, I think Wiggins and Clay not playing to their level that we know that they can play at is just hurting them so much. It gives them so many more question marks. That could be easily replaced, I think, with another option because I think the problem is Steph Curry is great and amazing, but he can't do it by himself. And I think we've always known that. He's never been that solo operator. You know what I mean? So it's like he needs another scorer behind him. So I think, not give up the farm. Like, you know what I mean? Like, don't give up too much to get like some, all star or something like that. But, just match the money and make a good decision and probably, like you said, move on from Chris Paul because I think he is one of the few assets that they really have that they could use to get, a star. And I think that's what they need. They need a star because I just don't foresee them, getting, I just don't foresee them getting like one of those productive role players or above average players and then that automatically puts them in contention again. Like they need another guy.
Yeah, it's just the main thing for them is that they're gonna have to do something, and then they're also gonna have to go on a run in terms of wins because we already talked about it, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like in the Western Conference, things can change at the top of a hat, right? Teams like say the Suns and the Lakers, right? They were closer to that upper tier, and now because they lost like one or two games, now all of a sudden they've dropped to play in territory, and again the teams around the Warriors are still winning, right? Like the Pelicans are winning. The Clippers have been on a tear. So I
Right.
mean, even like other teams like the Kings, and all those other teams around them, are winning. So that's the thing is that I feel like they're gonna have to do something. Um, like I said, I'm still not holding out on hope that Clay can be better, but I still feel like at the same time, come playoff time, you're just kind of nervous about like, are we really gonna bank on for 4 straight rounds he's gonna be,
If they
you
even
know,
get to the playoffs.
right? Yeah, because that's the thing. Because again, without like you said, that secondary star, you have to hope that those guys play well every game, and not just well, like really good.
Yeah.
And that's
And
what
it's
we
not
talk
even a
about.
star, it's a score. That's all they need.
Yeah, right. So, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So we'll see where they go from there.
Yeah, and oddly enough, I think we touched on the Warriors a decent amount, so I'm not really going to add too much of my 2 cents because I think you touched on it very well. But oddly enough, it kind of involves a name that you mentioned, Siakam. So I'm going to take the Toronto Raptors. I think they should be a big time seller here, and it's more so involving their future. I kind of want to look at Toronto and what their long term plan should be because I know that they gave up a first round pick for Pirtle last year, which was interesting. I think we were kind of in the mix where we were like, I don't really know if this move was that great. We didn't know if it was that bad. We didn't know. And I think it's turned out to be pretty weird because it seems like they haven't had a long-term plan pretty much since Kawhi left. They've had some good years since Kawhi's been gone, but not really a plan where it's like, okay, now we can get right back into the driver's seat and win a championship. So it is interesting. Right now, I think it's the pick that they gave up is supposed to be, at number 11. But it's also, I think, top 6 protected, which is interesting because that's not where they're, sitting right now. So I think they should, uh, they shouldn't have traded the pick in the first place. I think that's number one. But number two, I think they should be in the tanking position to, get that pick, up a little bit higher where it's like, okay, yeah, we can, get a top 5 pick and then we keep it. So then it's not that big of a deal. So that's the big thing. They do have some pieces, I specifically Siakam and OG Anunoby. Those are the 2 names that we've been hearing a lot about. And they're supposed to be free agents this season. And I think they're both probably going to get almost, if not max contracts. I think they're going to probably get or not max contracts, but max salaries. I think they'll probably be near that. Maybe not, on the dot. And then Scotty Barnes, I think off the table. He's got, I think 2 years left until, he's going to have a max deal or whatever. So I don't know. They're 10 and something. Let me see. They are, what the heck? Okay, yeah, they're 10 and 15. Sorry, brain fart.
Yeah.
Not
Bad.
very good. Very
Yeah.
mid, very bad. We were not fans of them from the jump. You can go back and rewatch the episodes, but I mean, Siakam is aging rapidly. I think he's 30, or he's going to be 30 in April or something like that. And he's drawn some appeal from a lot of teams, but it's like niche teams. It's weird, like Atlanta, Indiana, Golden State. So I mean, those are pretty interesting names. But the problem is he's inside the arc scorer. He's a solid defender, I think, as well. But his game is limited. That's the problem, and especially with all that money, it's tough. And you don't want to trade for a guy that could walk potentially. That's the problem. But at the same time, Toronto, it seems like they don't really want to extend him. They kind of just want to move on from him. That's the dichotomy that Toronto's dealing with, which is why I'm saying that they should be, sellers in this situation. And then also, we haven't even talked about Anunoby. He's a great 3-point shooter, and he's also one of the best perimeter defenders in the NBA. So similar to the Caruso, but the contract is a lot bigger. It's going to be a lot bigger as well. So I think there's probably going to be a decent amount of packages involving a lot of picks, especially with Anunoby. And what's odd is they've kind of already been offered these deals and packages in the past, and they kind of just passed on them, didn't bite. So that's the problem. I just don't know what the direction is and has been for Toronto, but I think it should be selling. I think Barnes has developed great this season. I think it's time that you can move on from Siakam and Anunoby. You're just kind of wasting them. The trio is not really working out, hasn't worked out for the past couple of years. So I think it's just time to move on. And, I think there are some notable suitors, especially for OG Anunoby. And then Siakam, he has his niche where I think the Warriors could probably do something like that. Maybe, the Raptors take on Chris Paul, they get significantly worse, protect their pick, then you draft, a better guy, something like that. That's kind of like what the formula should be for them. So that's why I'm going with sellers.
Right. Yeah, I think that's definitely what Toronto should be at this point in time. Because, like you said, they're 10-15. I mean, I don't think there's much of a pathway for them to really get much better. Because,
Yeah.
again, I think they are what they are.
No.
I know people were kind of like mixed about what they thought about this team. I think some people thought they'd be better. I think, like you said, we were definitely in the camp where we didn't really have too many good expectations for this team.
Mm-mm.
So, to me, I definitely think like when you look at the guys, on the team, like you said, OG Anunoby, Pascal Siakam, those are the two main guys, right? Those are the guys that we've been talking about forever,
Yeah.
at this point in terms of who they should move, right? Like you said, they're nearing the end of their deals. We know that a lot of teams want them. It's just a matter of, what does Toronto want back for them, and are they actually gonna, end up making the decision, to move these guys? Because again,
Sure.
like last year, right? We were hearing all that stuff about Anunoby, and that teams were really interested in him. But I don't know if the asking price was just too high. That's what it seems like. But either way, I mean, I get why you don't want to just give him up and get very little back because he's really good.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I also just don't really think that teams are going to give up like a whole lot because, like, when we've seen the trade market, it seems like as of late, people have kind of just been like, yeah, we're not going to give up like a crazy amount, for guys who aren't like, big time star players, right? Obviously, the Gobert trade happened, which was a lot. Obviously the Durant trade happened, which was a lot. But then after that, I mean, like, look at what happened after that, right? Like the Kyrie thing, right? He didn't really go for a whole lot. The Porzingis, Marcus Smart, Bradley Beal stuff, right? That wasn't like a significant, it was more like pick related. But also some of those guys are better. You know what I mean? Like Porzingis and Holiday are better than OG Anunoby.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that like what you're giving up to get those guys is more, right? So I think Anunoby, I feel like is the guy where it's like, it'll be easier to just fit him onto a roster, obviously because his salary is a lot smaller and his role like
Mm-hmm.
doesn't really change like depending on where he plays. Because like you said, he's mainly a 3-and-D guy. Who's like a little bit, better as an offensive player, not offensive compared to defense, but I'm just
Right.
saying like he's a 3-and-D plus type
Yes.
guy.
Yes.
He
Yes.
could do more than just shoot and defend.
Yes.
Um, but at the same time, right, you probably don't want to ask him to like do like a ton of things for your team on offense.
Right.
Um, so that's where I'm looking at it from the perspective of, I think he's probably like, in terms of Toronto's perspective, I feel like he's the guy that they probably want to keep. You know what I mean? Like, not that they don't want to keep both, but like you said, in terms of Siakam, if you keep him, you're gonna have to pay him a lot. And like, are you really gonna do that for a team that's not gonna be, much better than what it is right now? Again, like it could get better, but like they're not gonna be a contender with this group. So I definitely think like those two guys, can you prioritize packages where you can get, picks and expiring contracts, right? Because again, probably for Siakam, you could get like an okay or a decent young player. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think you're gonna get stuff like that for like Anunoby. It's
No.
probably gonna be like expiring contracts and like you said, a more pick related
Yeah.
package. So if you can do something like that, I think that's a pathway towards making the rebuild a little bit easier. Because the one thing you can't do is not do anything and then have these guys walk. Because there's definitely a chance that like at least one of those guys could just go to another team, right? Because we already know a guy like an Anunoby, he's gonna get offers from a lot of teams that have cap, right? We already heard, teams like say like a Philadelphia, right?
And look at
They
what
could
happened with Van Vliet last year.
yeah, exactly. Van Vliet. They didn't trade him. He ended up walking, and you lost him for nothing, right? You
Yeah.
got nothing back. You had to replace him with Dennis Schroeder, who again has been okay, but at the same time, wouldn't you have rather preferred to get something back for Van Vliet? Like as
I
opposed to
would take a
just
pick.
yeah, exactly. Like even if it's not a lot, it's better
Yeah.
than nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, obviously, yeah, like no trade is better than a bad trade, but also like again, getting back something is better than just losing a guy for nothing. So I don't know what they could have gotten for Van Vliet. I don't even know if teams like were going to trade a crazy amount, trade a crazy amount to get him. Just because if you're trading for him, you were going to have to pay him, and he got a lot of money from Houston. So, but in this situation, right, we know with Siakam, I know initially, right, he didn't want to be traded because he probably thought, oh, I can try to be all NBA and get this supermax. Well, that doesn't look like it's going to happen this year.
Yeah.
So, at this point, if you're Toronto, now you have a little bit more leverage. Where like now, you can trade him and do what you want. It's just the other team, obviously, if you're trading for him, you got to be in the position where if we trade for him, we're going to re-sign him, right? Which I'm going to assume that that's what's going to happen for whoever trades him, right? Like if you're Golden State, you're not going to trade for Siakam and then let him walk, right? If you're, like a Sacramento who's been, you know, on, on that radar as of late, right? Like you're not going to just trade for him and let him walk. So
Yeah.
I'm not worried about that. It's just I'm more worried about like what's Toronto's decision making in terms of and the thought process because it just feels like they've been kind of playing like a game of chicken, so far over the last year, and I feel like I hope they don't do it again, but it wouldn't shock me if they, just did it again. Like,
Yeah.
even with like Jakob Poeltl, like you said, they're in a position where they gave up a pick to get him, and they're not really any better than they were before they got him. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? So it's like, and now they're paying him like 20 million a year, and he's not bad, but he's also like, wow, we're paying, we're giving this guy, 20+ million a year, like that's a weird spot to be in. So, I think like I said, it's time to sell. It's time to move these guys, specifically those two guys we already mentioned, and then go from there and start the rebuild, right? Build around Scotty Barnes, see what you can do with him, see what you can do with whatever incoming young guys. I know this draft class isn't supposed to be great, but we'll see what they can do and then just go from there. I don't think we need to keep playing this game of let's keep these guys and see if we can be good. You're just not good. Like I don't,
Yeah.
and again, we didn't think Toronto was going to be a good team this year. They weren't very good last
Yeah.
year,
It sucked.
and they didn't really, to me, get significantly better with what they did in the offseason. I mean, like
Right.
it's in the results, right? Like they're 10-15, and again, it's not going to get any better. So,
Yeah.
um, so now moving on, into the next group, I think this one is kind of interesting, in terms of like there's just a lot of options they could do, and I think this one is the Philadelphia 76ers. So I think this is a team that should definitely be, a buyer. I don't think that's any surprise there, right? They're currently 18-7, right? They're third in the Eastern Conference, tied with the Milwaukee Bucks. I think it may have changed because I think the Bucks just won against the Rockets. But either way, they're sitting towards the top of the East. You got Embiid playing great basketball, right? You got a new coach who seems like he's been able to get the best out of a lot of guys, right? Tyrese Maxey, right? As we mentioned early on, looks like he could be a most improved favorite, right? Averaging 26 a game, 7 assists, 40% from three, 46 from the field, right? Post Harden trade, right? Now they got a number of other guys, on the wings, right, that can help them defensively. And they can also space the floor,
For
right?
sure.
Kelly Oubre, right? He was, going crazy, right, initially when they signed him. Then obviously he had the incident that happened, where he was out for a while. And then he came back, so he's not playing quite as well as of late. But it's still a a plus in terms of like that was obviously a really good signing. So they have a lot of guys where we know like who's going to be in the rotation, who's going to give them quality minutes. And now they're in a position where they can do one of two things, right? They could either you know take some of those contracts that they got in the Harden trade, combine them with picks, and then maybe pair them together to get some type of star player, right? Or, maybe you can move a couple of guys around that's already on the roster, like switch some pieces up. Tobias Harris has been playing great, but maybe you feel like maybe we could get an upgrade, at the small forward spot. Or you just keep him. Or, you could just wait until the offseason, and kind of go that route and then, just sign a guy in free agency. The free agency class isn't that great to me, but still, either way, I think they should be buyers, and I think they should definitely try to prioritize, doing going in, right now. But at the same time, I can understand if they don't want to do it, because again, we still don't have a great idea of what stars are out on the market, right? Because the only one we know right now, I guess, is Levine, and I don't think, and again, like, yeah, if you're the Sixers, you could get him, but what if a better guy comes up, like a month from now, then it's like you put all your eggs into that basket and you missed out. Um, but I think, in terms of the roster so far, it's a pretty good framework. It's just a matter of, again, can you see if you can maybe consolidate it and move a couple of those guys and get somebody that's better? Maybe, like I said, you can get a better option at the wing. Maybe you can get a better option at that other guard spot. I think ideally, like next to Maxi, you probably want like a bigger guard that's more defensive oriented, just because he's not a great defender because he's undersized. But either way, we've already talked about it, like where we love all the options that they have, in terms of what they should do. So I definitely think they should be a buyer because again, like it's going to be tough because again, depending on what they get, would you still probably pick them, against like a, Boston or Milwaukee? Maybe not, but
Mhm.
at the same time, as long as Embiid's on the roster, right, you got to prioritize winning. And
Yeah.
they just recently gave Daryl Morey, right, an extension, I believe, through 2028. So clearly, they're pretty confident in the work he's been able to, do so far with, what he's got.
Yeah. I mean, they're in one of the most unique situations I think we've seen in a long time, especially for a team that's actually, in that win now mode and is a contender. I think, they have so many options and, they do have, I guess you can call him a smart man in Daryl Morey, you know, who's at the, is the reins for this franchise. And he can do whatever he wants. They could add another perimeter defender like Caruso, or, they could get, a distributing guard like a traditional point guard, to back up Tyrese Maxey, or start alongside Tyrese Maxey, like say like Tyus Jones, because I mean there's a lot of things that they could do. They have that infinite cap space glitch that they basically have, because what the thing is like they have two options. They can pretty much go in like win now mode and try and win the championship this year, which I don't think they should do. I don't think they're going to do it. Or they could wait it out and, really, really focus on 2025 and 2026. And it's like, okay, yeah, now we'll have a shot because we have all these assets that we can move. And then you can just build a team over the next 2 years that could probably take the reins of the Eastern Conference. That's kind of the way that I view them. So I kind of view them as like a buyer and a seller for sure. Especially with Morey, because I think he's a great gambler, in terms of figuring out what on earth he can do. Because I think we've seen him be able to do some amazing things with a lot of cap. It's just recently he hasn't had a lot of space because of so many stars and all the roster stuff. So I think the future's looking bright for them. They could either go out amazingly in the playoffs, and actually get out of the second or first round. Or they could just wait till 2025 and 2026 where the East is pretty much theirs.
Yeah, like you said, I know I mentioned like they should probably, consolidate, but at the same time, like you said, consolidation doesn't have to be, getting a star. It could
Hmm.
just be getting some better, role players than the ones they already have,
Right.
and then you can go from there. Because, like you said, there's definitely a danger, and then that's why I said don't just go in on the Levine basket right now. If
Right.
there's like really, really good star that's out there, maybe a month or so from now, maybe you try to get into that conversation, right? Like, let's say it's like, I don't know, like a Donovan Mitchell. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but like, say, like a guy, like if a guy like that's available, maybe you want to jump in, or I don't know, if a situation in, I guess some other, side of town, right? Like let's say like if Portland's having a fire sale, not that they have stars, but maybe you could get like two guys from there or something like that. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So that's where, like you said, you still have to take a patient approach because what you don't want to do is you don't want to do the wrong move and then you're back in a position to where you were before, where you're
Right.
probably not good enough to come out, but then you have potentially now less flexibility to do whatever you want. But like you said, it seems like, Morey, he's got, a gift in terms of like you said, being able to kind of make moves that seem like gambles where it's like, what is this guy doing? Um, and then he's able to take that and make something out of it, right? Because again, like with the Ben Simmons thing, right? Everybody was saying like, this guy needs to be traded right now. He's not playing. He's a problem. He's a distraction to the team. He waited until the very last minute, right? And then he got the Harden trade, right? And it seemed like that, everything was fine and dandy there. Then that situation blows up, and then he's able to put them in a position. So now they're still a really good team. So
Right.
yeah, so I think definitely like in terms of, what I had already mentioned, right? I think they should be, a buyer, but like you said, also don't be afraid to, you move some of those guys and be like, oh, maybe we just wait it out until next year. We'll
Right.
see. Embiid, I know at the beginning of the season, like in the off season, right? He kind of mentioned like, I want to win whether or not it's Philly or somewhere else, right? So he was kind of hinting at, the idea of like I'm not afraid to, just kind of get out of here and leave. But
Yeah.
now Philly's in a spot where I think at the very least they've probably earned his trust back, at least for now. It's just again you got to pull off the right move, and like I said, can you either consolidate and get some better guys, to fill out the rest of that roster. Now that's a little bit deeper than it was before, right? Maybe you can move a Marcus Morris, right? Maybe you can move like a Furkan Korkmaz, or somebody like that, and bring in someone else.
Yeah.
Or do you just, like I said, do you just go all in and pick up a star right when they become available? So they have options. So that's why I think they're definitely on that list for sure.
Yeah. Um, and my next team is the OKC Thunder. They are in one of the best positions I think of all time. They're not just a buyer, they're not just a seller. They pretty much run the entire NBA. Trade anything, free agency, pretty much anything. Picks, drafts, they have it all. I think there's about what seven or eight slots on their roster that are pretty much locks. SGA, Chet, J Dub, Giddy, Lou Dort, Cason Wallace, Isaiah Joe, guys like that. I mean, and then they have so many other young guys coming off the bench too. But I don't know. It would be interesting to see them, move some stuff. They do have some tradable salary, I think, in the deep bench because I think they're underrated in terms of their depth for sure. They have Bertans, who's not doing anything. I can't remember how you pronounce the guy's name. Micic.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
that's it.
Yeah. So he's also, not really playing crazy minutes or anything like that. So, that's around $27 million in salary, something like that. Um, so it's kind of like they're kind of playing a dangerous game at the same time, though, because it's use it or lose it, I guess, is kind of the way that I would say. Their spare money could potentially run out. They're not going to add any contracts that are going to extend, I don't think, beyond like the 2025, 2026 season. So, when that bill hits, it's going to be a really expensive roster because I think we
Right.
already know that Holmgren, he's probably going to get a max deal. And then Williams is obviously going to get a max deal. So then it's going to be like, into that tax realm with the new CBA, if I'm not mistaken. So, and we've seen them kind of go this route before, and it seems like history's somewhat repeating themselves, with KD. They're kind of just making a new big three, it seems like. And I love it. I'm here for it. But it would be interesting to see them move some stuff because I think they do need to get rid of it. At least, not per se the picks, but just some of the younger guys and maybe get some impact players. Like, and I know they're really good right now because I think they're sitting at number 2 in the West. They're 16-8, so they are playing very well. It's just more so of a future kind of thing, I think, with them.
Right.
And it's like I think maybe Giddy is probably the only guy right now that I think is in a weird spot, on the court where it's like the play hasn't been amazing. And I know it's hard to like talk about Giddy with all the stuff that he has going on, but like legitimately on the court, like the shooting is not great. And I
Right.
think that's the interesting thing. I think if somebody is like, okay, we can get past his shooting issue and whatnot, but like we'll take him.
Right.
Like I think he could be expendable if it's a
Yeah.
star like that's like actually at that same level price. I don't know.
Exactly.
I think you could throw in Giddy in there probably, but outside of that, I think everyone else that I mentioned is probably untouchable.
Right.
But yeah, they have a stockpile, and they need to do something. He can do whatever he wants. Presti, that is. That's
Yeah.
their GM. So
Right.
he could do whatever he wants in terms of moving picks, players, gaining things. I mean, it's scary. So I think they're just everything buyer, seller, and whatever else you want to categorize them
Yeah,
as.
'cause like you said, that's definitely the team, one of the big teams to look out for in terms of, like you said, they've been great so far in the regular season. Like you said, 16-8, just got a big win over Denver, right?
Yeah.
Shea with the winner. Um, and they, in terms of their net rating, right, fourth in net rating, 8th defensively, 7th on offense. You know, their main Achilles heel is they're a bad rebounding team, right? They're one of the worst rebounding teams in the NBA. And when you look at the personnel, right, it makes sense, right? You know, they don't really run like a lot of bigs out there, right? It's basically Chet Holmgren, who's, been playing pretty well, right? But, and even he, like, as a big, is a different kind of guy. Although, again, in fairness, he's been rebounding, um, relatively well, right? Like 8 a game. But you don't really have like, any other guys that are like big guys where it's like, oh, they can box out, they can get offensive rebounds, whatever.
Right.
So that's the main thing. They just need more size, right? And that's the issue where like come playoff time, even if they're a 2 seed, there's a potential where like if they run into a bad matchup, they could be had. You know what I mean? Just
Sure.
depending on who it is, right? Like even the Kings, I think that's a situation where like that could be a matchup where I think the Kings might actually be able to win.
Sure.
Just because again, even though the Kings don't have like a ton of size, they have enough size where they could make Oklahoma City look kind of small. So I think that's where like if you're Oklahoma City, that's probably what you should prioritize. If you're gonna make a trade, they could just be in the position, like you said, where we're not gonna make like a big trade for a guy because we just want to see what we have. Um, but again, at the same time, if they get to a point in the season where like it's very clear that like they could just be like a couple pieces away from making like a serious run, that's where like you really do have to kind of talk yourself into something. And like you said, Josh Giddey, maybe Lou Dort, right? Like those are the two guys where it's like they're not completely untouchable, right? Like Shea's untouchable, obviously. Chet's untouchable, and I think Jalen Williams is untouchable pretty
For
much. Like,
sure. Yes.
like you said. And then some of those young guys, like a Cason Wallace. I'm not saying he's untouchable, but he's played very well on a
Hmm.
cheap contract because he's a rookie.
Right.
Isaiah Joe is a shooter, right? Like you said, they have other guys who aren't even really playing. Um, like you have like a guy like you said, like a Micic, right? Who's
Yeah.
on a not like a tiny contract. He's not really doing anything. Bertans doesn't really play at all. He's not doing anything. A guy like a Pokashevsky, right? That's a guy you could just throw into a deal,
Yeah.
where a team could be like, we'll take him, and just see what we can do with him. Um, or something like that. And like you said, obviously, then the other factor is all those draft picks, right? Where like they just have, picks after pick after pick after pick,
They can
where
outbid anybody.
yeah,
Scary.
exactly. Yeah, if it comes down to picks, they can outbid anybody. And that's where, if there's a legitimate guy on the market, this year at some point, like they could have an edge because they have the combination of young players and picks that they could move. And like you said with Giddy, he's just not playing that well this season, right? Even
Right.
obviously before the stuff that was going on, he wasn't playing great. Like you said, the shooting is still an issue, right? Where he's shooting, 33% from three, right, on 2.5 attempts a game. So he doesn't even really look to shoot a lot of them. And when he takes them, he doesn't make them. Um, he still does a lot of other things well, right? He rebounds well. Obviously, he passes well. But, the shooting is a problem. And, Oklahoma City is a team, they're, I think, one of the best 3-point shooting teams in the league, right? So, because they have a lot of solid outside shooters. But at the same time, late in games, right, there's been a lot of games where even though he started every game, there's been many games where he's just not closing because his offense has been a problem, right? He's playing, 25 minutes a game. Whereas say like, other guys like Shea, 35 minutes a game, Jalen Williams, 32 minutes a game, Holmgren, 30 minutes a game, Lou Dort, 28 minutes a game. So, um, there's a lot of games where they're closing with Cason Wallace, who's a rookie, right? 22 minutes a game, because you're just not getting a lot out of Giddy from an offensive scoring standpoint,
Yeah.
shooting standpoint. So, like you said, I think that's kind of the guy to look at where if you're making a big, big move and you have to give up like a good young player, like that's the guy where you probably look at that. If it's not one of those other guys. But, like you said, they have the flexibility to do whatever they want because they could just talk themselves into, being a buyer, and going all in and, trying to win right now. But they could also just say, we have a super young roster. We're probably just not ready yet. So, let's just see what they have.
Right.
But they're going to have to make a decision, like you said, within the next couple of seasons, because eventually that bill, like you said, will come due and they're going to have to start paying guys, right? They already paid Lou Dort, who's making, I think, like, what, like 50, like close to 20 million a year, I
Yeah.
think,
It's a
something like
decent
that,
amount of
right?
money.
Yeah, exactly. And again, he's not bad at all. He's a good player.
Right.
It's just, again, once you start adding him, then Shea, right? Whenever his new contract comes in, I think he, re-signed not that long ago, but you'll obviously have to sign him again and give him way more money. Like you said, Chet Holmgren, Jalen Williams, even other guys on the roster. Um, it's just not enough, in terms of like with the new CBA, you're going to have to make some tough choices. And if you can make them sooner rather than later, right, then you'll save yourself, some problems down the line. But at the same time, I don't expect them to like just rush in and make a bad trade. I think, they're just gonna weigh, how this goes, right? Because what if they have like a weird slide where like, for like a stretch of like 7, 8 games, they kind of go below 500 and then kind of all of a sudden start falling back down. I'm not saying that's gonna happen, but I'm just saying like, the standings are so tight.
Yeah.
Um, where once you lose like 3, 4, 5 games, then all of a sudden you're in a different spot. So I feel like for them, I think it could go a lot of ways, but they should probably lean towards buyer. Like in the sense of like you don't even have to do anything major because we already said you could just move a couple of the guys that aren't playing and then throw in a pick and then maybe get like
Exactly.
a guy who's not quite as good but better than some of the guys you have right now, and
Like an
that could still
impact player.
be
Like
good.
they could get Caruso. They could literally get somebody like that.
Yeah, or they could try to get like some type of big,
Right.
like if there's some type of big out there, maybe you might be like, oh, let's go get like a Clint Capella, or something
Right.
like, let's go get, some other center out there who's like, relatively decent,
Right.
something like that.
Above average at least.
Right, exactly. If you can find a way to get, one of those type of guys, like I said, just somebody that can give you some more size and rebounding and physicality, that will help, and that I think that can go a long way towards, being the difference between them potentially winning or losing a series.
Yeah.
Because there's going to be some matchups where that rebounding is going to be a major problem, and it may
Agreed.
not hurt them, because again, you may just have a run where you just don't run into any teams that, are problem matchups for you, but
Yeah,
at
it's the
the
luck
same
of the
time,
draw.
yeah, it's the luck of the draw, and you just, you want to be prepared and put yourself in the best position to win as possible. So,
Yeah.
I think that's definitely, I think one of those teams where like they could potentially swing a lot of things, depending on, what they decide to do, because like
Sure.
then
Agreed.
if they get a big time impact player, then all of a sudden, that, like I said, that changes the makeup of the West, and now it's much stronger. And then you might have to throw them into like, oh, they're one of those teams that could, win a couple rounds and get to the conference finals. So,
Yeah.
um, then next up, there's another team, that I'm moving to. This one is kind of like I guess a more muted one, but at the same time, they've definitely kind of struggled this year. So I think this is something where they should probably kind of look at what they should do. And I think that's the Utah Jazz, right? So the Utah
Yeah. I have
Jazz,
them too. I had Philly and I have Utah as well.
right? So with the Jazz, they're 9-17, right? So they've obviously taken a step back this year compared to where they were last year, right? Because for most of last year, they were, in that playoff play-in mix. At one point, they were early on, like I think towards the top of the West. You knew that wasn't going to last, but they were in the play-in spot, for a while.
Yeah.
Um, but either way, right? They've been bad. 26th on offense, 25 on defense, right? 26th in net rating. Pretty awful. Um, a major step back from where they were last year. And again, that this was a team where I was, thinking that they may have acquired a little bit more talent, but they're still probably a worse team because I just, I mentioned in the offseason I didn't really love the guard situation where, I know we kind of talked about like, because I think you kind of mentioned you like some of the guards more, and I was just in my thought, in my mind, I'm thinking like, they're more talented, but they may not necessarily be as good of fits. Um, and I think that's part of the issue. Obviously, it's also just kind of like a weird roster. They've also had some injuries, so that hasn't helped either. But now they're kind of in a position where, there's a lot of guys where like maybe you would have been like, oh, we got to keep these guys. To now, maybe they're not quite as safe. So I think this is a team where this is an example of a seller. Um, and there's a lot of guys, right? Obviously, towards the top of the list, right? We already know Markkinen. I know his name has come up at times, where like he's probably not untouchable. But at the same time, if you're Utah, it's kind of rough because again, he's a really good player, but he's not making a whole lot of money. So like, if you're Utah, the only way to probably get back something that's not just picks is you'd have to throw in like 2, 3 guys, maybe. Because again, like, for the caliber of player he is, he makes like 18 a year, right? So, if you look at most guys that are making 18 million a year, they're probably not in the range that he is. Because last year I think he was all NBA, or if not all NBA, he was very close.
Yeah.
Um, so, it hasn't been quite as good this year, but also the team as a whole hasn't been as good. So, some of the young guys, right? Keontae George, he's been really good. Um, Ochai Agbaji, up and down, but outside of that, again, like Clarkson, I don't think he's been as good as last year. Um,
That's why they're
again, Walker Kessler, right? He's not been as good as he was last year. Um, the guard situation is definitely worse, right? Sexton, Taylor Horton Tucker. It seems like every other game they're kind of changing up the guard spot. I mean, they were starting Keontae George, right? He was
Yeah.
initially coming off the bench, then he was starting. So that lets you know the guard spot was kind of rough. Um, they have a lot of guys that can move. I already mentioned the guards, right? Even a guy like a John Collins, right? He was a guy where they didn't really give up a lot to get him. And he's been okay, right? 15 a game, 8.5 rebounds, 48 from the field, 38 from three. But, they already mentioned there's been some frustrations with him. It seems like he's not fit in, that great. Again, he's not much of a playmaker passer. Utah's kind of a team that moves the ball around a lot. Um, and like that's just not what he is. Obviously, he's not a great defender. Um, we'll see. But either way, they have a lot of options in terms of guys to move. Nobody other than Markkinen where I think like you're gonna get a lot back. But they're guys that I think if you add them to like a playoff rotation, they could help. Even a guy like a Kelly Olynyk, right?
Mhm.
He's a guy that's been in some big playoff games.
Yeah.
Obviously, so he can probably help some teams, obviously. And again, I already mentioned, right? Clarkson maybe as a guy off the bench, not as a starter, but as just like another guard scorer off the bench, maybe he can help. Um, so they have some guys to move, and I think they're probably going to move at least a couple of these guys because again, like they're not very good. Those guys like Kelly Olynyk, is he going to stay in Utah long term? Right? I would imagine he would probably prefer to play for a contender, as opposed to kind of just sitting it out in Utah. Same with some of these other guys, right? Like Clarkson already got paid, essentially. So like he's already got his money, so he could just probably go somewhere else to win. So that's what I think they should probably do. Um, you know, again, like I didn't expect much from them this season. I think some people thought they might be, about where they were last year, but they're definitely on pace to be worse. And I think, you might as well just, continue the rebuild, move the guys, and then do what you can. I don't think they have to trade Markkinen. I would only do it if you get like something really, really good back. Um, but outside of that, there's no one else on the roster where I'm like, oh, we have to keep this guy. I mean, I guess other than like a couple of the guys they just recently drafted, right? Like Kessler, and some of those other guys. But outside of that, like other guys, nah.
Yeah, and it's like their problem was they overperformed last season, I think for sure, and that was the kind of weird thing about their off season. I know a lot of people were kind of mixed on it, but they kind of treated it like, they were going to be like a really good team where they didn't, add too much crazy stuff, but I know they added John Collins and then the draft, I thought they did very well. But it's just weird. It's a hard thing to really wrap my head around, but I always have to remind myself like who their general manager is. It's Danny Ainge. So the guy is very interesting. He's questionable, and I think we know that he's willing to trade anybody for anything and for the right price for sure. He's very unpredictable, so it wouldn't surprise me if Markkinen does get traded. Or even like you were talking about, Jordan Clarkson and Kelly Olynyk, because I don't think they're gonna. Those two are not gonna fetch like first round picks at not at this stage in their careers. So I think they can probably go to like, I guess, you know, winners without much to trade. I guess is that's kind of like the contenders because I think they could easily fill like contender niches where it's like Jordan Clarkson could easily be a spark plug, and then Olynyk could say even go to like an OKC, where they need some size, rebounding, and then he also is a great passer. So it's interesting. But it seems like their path was also questionable, kind of similar to the Raptors, where it's so odd. And I think the main thing that's hurting this team is like Clarkson and like Kelly Olynyk. They're great players. Like I don't think I have a problem with them. I don't think you have a problem with them. But the problem is they're kind of hindering the younger guys' development. If you know what I'm trying to hint at, you know.
Yeah.
So I get it. I think they do need to move on from a lot of the guys, including John Collins for sure. Because I don't think he's even been the same player as he was, in his peak in Atlanta. The shooting is down tremendously, and obviously the bounce is definitely not there anymore. So I think they're open to trading him, so that opens a whole different can of worms. But I think a lot of people will be gone, and I kind of want to backtrack to my statement about Markkinen earlier. I think he probably will get traded, honestly. Now, the more that I'm thinking about it, I think, nobody's untouchable on this roster, like you said,
Okay.
except for the guys that they drafted recently. I think, it's probably just everybody's probably going to be gone. Not by the deadline for sure, but,
Right.
in the offseason, I think most of the names that we mentioned are probably going to be gone.
Yeah, because like I said, I just feel like that's probably where it's headed. Where it's like,
Yeah,
a good chunk of those guys, could help other teams.
right.
And it's like if you're Utah, you just might as well prioritize, the young guys. You can get some cheap veterans, in free agency where you don't have to give them a lot, and they can kind of, be like veteran mentors. So you
Yeah,
don't, so that way it's not like just 12 young guys all trying to vie for minutes.
they should be
But
tanking, in my opinion.
yeah, yeah, and again, like everybody's talking about like, well, there's not really any great guys to tank for. But, at the same time, and I get that, but also like if you're Utah, like you're just not good enough, I think, in the
Right.
Western Conference to be able to really get, anywhere. You know what I mean?
Nothing's worse than mediocrity. Just saying.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's the main issue there. Um, yeah. So I mean, yeah, I think Utah is gonna be a big seller.
Yeah.
For sure. Like I don't know, like you said, I don't know how many guys are gonna be gone, but I think they will at least a couple of those guys, will be moved by the time the deadline rolls around.
Yeah, and those are all my teams because I shared Philly with you and Utah. So I think you have one more left.
Yeah, so pretty much this one is kind of like I guess like a semi, 2-4, right? Where
Okay.
it's like, basically like, the horrible team, right? Like, Detroit, Portland, I guess, is not very good, right? Kind of like a combination of that where it's like,
Okay.
those are other teams that should also be selling, right? Like,
Do you
and
think the
like
Wizards should be as well?
you said, what?
Do you think the Wizards should be selling as well? Because that was kind of the mind frame that I was thinking from as well.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So like the bad teams at the
Sure.
bottom are the teams that should be the sellers, right? Where it's like, if you're the Wizards, you already mentioned, right? All the guys on the roster, that are veterans, right? They should be available, for whatever type of package you can get
Yes.
for those guys, right?
Yeah.
Again, we don't have to mention every single name
Right.
on the
Right.
Wizards. You already know,
Yeah.
right? Same with Detroit, right? Any of the veteran guys, if you can get something back for them, right? See what you can get, because again, like you said, I think we're kind of past the point where like you can just get a first round pick, for like a bench guy,
Right.
right? Because last year we talked about it, right? Where like, guys were coming off the bench and they were getting moved for like, a bunch of second round picks,
Yeah. It's
right?
kind of interesting to see the
Yeah,
market shift.
right. Like we saw like, what was it? It was like Jay Crowder go for like 5 second round picks, right?
Right.
Or like Thomas Bryant go for like 5 second round picks,
You're right.
things like that. So, I mean, again, you would like to get back more, but you're just not. So like, if you're the Wizards, if you're, Portland, they have a couple of guys that I'm sure teams would probably be
Oh
okay
yeah,
with.
for sure.
I don't know which guys like they're gonna say are quote unquote untouchable, but right, like obviously we know some of the names they can move, right? Like maybe Malcolm Brogdon, maybe even a Jeremy Grant. I'm not
Yeah,
saying
for sure.
like those type of guys
Because
where
he's
they're
been
probably
underperforming.
yeah, I mean, part of it's I think he was out with a concussion for a while, and
Yeah.
also like, there's not like a version that was gonna live up to
To the
yeah,
contract. Yeah,
that he
I
was
feel
thinking.
you.
But at the same time, there are teams that will be like, well, if he's on our team and he's not like a number one, number two option, we'll take that. You could do worse. So, guys like that. Then obviously, if you look at the Spurs, I mean, I guess a guy like a Doug McDermott, as a shooter, right? Is there? I mean, Jetty Osman's been pretty solid for the Spurs. So, like, if
Yeah.
you're the Spurs, maybe you shouldn't just like give him up. But again, those type of teams, at the bottom, already with Detroit, guys like Joe Harris, Alec Burks, just again, veteran guys that can help out, playoff contending teams, right? If you can get something, anything back for them, I think that's what you would like to do. Again, you're not going to get first round picks, right? You're not going to get 3 first round picks, for Joe Harris. You're not going to get, 3 first round picks for, like, I don't know, Tyus Jones or
Right.
Daniel Gafford or somebody like that. But
Right.
if you can get something back, to help out, to help make the rebuild easier, maybe you can, get like, a young player on one of those teams who's not playing a lot, and then you can just see what you got. Maybe they're good, maybe they're not. Those type of deals. That's what they should be looking,
Yeah.
in my opinion.
Agreed.
So yeah, and that's why like I kind of just pulled them together.
Yeah. Because I mean, they're both all four of those teams are like so bad where it's like they have some bright spots, but the bright spots just are totally eclipsed by the darkness that like just encapsulates these teams because they're so bad this season. Detroit 2-24. It's been really, really bad for them. Spurs, I
Yeah,
think, it hasn't been as bad just because I think they're more entertaining to watch. Obviously, Wemby brings that draw, and he does get a lot of national media attention. But the Spurs themselves, I don't think they do. But I am curious to see what these teams will do. And I think you're right. They'll just probably look to move all their vets and just take the best deal available. Simple as that. I think a lot of them have learned their lessons. With Detroit, hopefully they've learned their lesson with the Bogdanovich whole situation like that. messing up and turning down some stuff. And then the Wizards is a brand new regime. Spurs are in the middle of their rebuild and they have their generational talent right there. And then Portland, same thing, hopefully with Scoot. And then obviously just moving on from Damian Lillard is something not to be, trifled with. So I think they all are kind of like in the same spot, but they all have different unique situations, which is the cool thing. And I think I'm looking forward to see what all four of these teams do during the deadline.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Again, I think it should be a busy deadline because there's so many teams that I think, have, you know, things that they would like to get. And then I
Yeah.
think, you have all those teams at the bottom, that have pieces that, those teams would want to take,
Yeah.
give back. So I think that's where we're going to see probably a busy deadline. We're going to do, I'm sure, the same thing that we did last
Yep.
season, right? Where we had, a live stream, on the day of the deadline.
Yeah.
I'm sure it'll go, pretty much more smoothly than it
Yeah.
did last time.
For
But
sure.
either way, it's going to be something to keep an eye on because again, you know, I think it's mid-February normally, right, when the trade deadline
Mm-hmm.
happens. So we're not super far off from, you know, teams kind of like in a time crunch, right? I know it's like a couple months, but it's going to come up fast. And when
Yeah.
it comes up, hopefully, we see a bunch of teams, do something,
Yep.
to make up their situations. Because again, we already know, like, I think you can already kind of see which teams are like, the biggest buyers and sellers. Because like obviously, I feel like in the Western Conference, you could name probably like almost the entire conference as like a group of buyers, right? Like the only teams that are probably not really buyers in the Western Conference are the teams like way at the bottom, right? Like we already mentioned, right? Like the Spurs, the Blazers, teams like that, right? But other than that, right? Like in the West, like almost everybody else should feel like if we, improve our roster, we should be in a pretty good spot.
Yeah.
And then in the East, right, maybe that's a different story, right? Like we didn't even mention a team like the Pacers, right, who could be, a buyer as well. What if they get, like an OG Anunoby or somebody like that?
Right. Or even
But still,
Siakam. Like they
yeah,
could get
exactly.
somebody like that.
Right. So, we'll see. Again, trade deadline is always, a fun time, I think, for
Yeah.
sure. Um, now we're getting into the news rumors, section to wrap things up. So obviously, the first thing I guess is we are nearing, the return, of Ja Morant, right? Obviously, he had, the 25 game suspension, to begin the season. I think they have one more game, so it should be like on the day that this episode comes out, right? Monday, they play Oklahoma City. And then after that, I think Ja will be eligible to come back, the next day on Tuesday, against the New Orleans Pelicans, right? So, the Grizzlies, they've been through it this year, right? They're
Yeah.
currently 6-18. I'm gonna guess they're probably gonna be 6-19, after they play the Thunder.
True.
We'll see. But, regardless, they've lost four in a row. Um, but at the same time, Ja's coming back, and that's a guy where, because of how good he is, he could kind of just potentially, kind of turn things around. So I guess, kind of to start off, what are you expecting, to see from Ja? Obviously, I'm gonna assume he might be probably a little rusty, coming back because he hasn't played, since the playoffs last year. And even though I'm sure he's probably been practicing and working out, right? There's no substitution for actual games. But I think, what version of Ja you get, could kind of go a little ways in determining, how Memphis kind of fares this season. Obviously, they've had a ton of other injuries, aside from the Ja suspension that haven't made it easy as well.
Mm-hmm.
But, I guess there is a world where, like, if you go on, like, a major run, maybe you could get back into that play-in spot or something like that. I mean, again, they're still, really, really far behind. But, math-wise, they're not, like, all the way out of it, but it's pretty close. You know what I mean? Where it's like a few more losses and you're probably done. Like I said, they're not gonna just tank the season away. I
Mm-mm.
don't think because once Ja comes back, I think they're gonna try to win games.
Yeah.
But what is your expectation in terms of like what they're gonna get from Ja? And do you think that there's like a path for Memphis to turn the season around, not to come out of the West or anything, but like just to make it not be a complete disaster where like maybe they could like go on a big run just because he's back, they're better, and then they kind of maybe get into the mix or something like that.
Well, I'm expecting a lot from Ja. I think, if we put his off the court issues aside, I think, he's a great hard worker. I think he's shown improvement every single year. So hopefully he's been in the lab and, getting better every single day, since he made his mistake and got suspended. So I'm expecting a lot from him. I'm expecting his playmaking to get a lot better too. I know the roster and the supporting cast isn't that great due to the bare bones and the injury and stuff like that, or injuries. I think there's about three of them. But I think we should still look for them to ease him back in to things. So the workload on him, I don't think is going to be too crazy, but I think he'll probably be looking to set his teammates up and prove to himself and the team that he's still the leader of the Memphis Grizzlies. Because I think in his press conference he did take accountability. It seemed like he's taking the right steps, and hopefully this never happens again. And yeah, I'm not gonna say I'm expecting him to return to like all-star levels, but I'm expecting him to put the team on his back because that's pretty much all they have right now in terms of a viable offensive weapon. And as for the team itself, I would probably put them in that 11 to 10 range. It's just I don't know who the heck is gonna come out and who's gonna be knocked down because it's like they're what 13 games behind Minnesota. That's a
Yeah,
tough.
like
That's
yeah, the one seed, like a
yeah,
top seed, I think is
yeah,
out of the question.
yeah,
I think it's more so can they get back to the play-in.
yeah. But I'm just saying, like in reference, the 13 games behind is kind of wild. I know that's about five less than or five more than Golden State. So that kind of puts it into perspective. So they'd have to do a lot of winning, and they'd have to hope for a lot of losing in the West, which is probably not ideal. So I'd probably say they take over Utah and maybe Golden State. But who knows with that because it all depends on what Ja comes back as. But I'm hoping that he does return to at least some form of the Ja that we know.
Yeah, and the issue is like early on when he comes back, like they have like a really brutal stretch
Yeah,
where it's like obviously the first one is the Pelicans at New Orleans, right? Then you play the Pacers, you play the Hawks, so you get a little bit of a reprieve there. But then
yeah,
like the Pelicans, the Nuggets, the Clippers, the Kings, teams like the Lakers, the Mavs, the Suns, the Clippers, like there's a lot of tough teams coming up. So like they don't really have much more time, I think, to kind of make some type of run. Because, if they can make a run, and get to that bottom spot, then, again, maybe they could do some crazy stuff in the play in. But either way, I think like, them being a contender this year, I think is just
no,
out of the
it's
window because
done.
I just think there's too much ground to make up. Maybe if they get healthy, that's the other thing. Because again, we already know a couple of guys, like Steven Adams, he's not going to be back this year, right? So you're already without, one of your best big options. Brandon Clark, right? He's probably not going to be back until, maybe if they survive in quote unquote April,
Right.
something like that. So that's where it gets really tough, I think, for Memphis. But it's going to be wild because, again, if they can actually string together some wins, then all of a sudden now you got like 12 teams, trying to actually be good in the Western Conference.
Sure.
And again, then you're at a point where it's like, that's going to be crazy because, again, of those 12 teams, right, 10 of those will get into the play-in, so that means two of them will just miss it all together.
Mm-hmm.
Then you still have two other teams that are going to get knocked out of the play-in. And then,
Because
you're left with 8 teams. So like there's a scenario where it's like, there's going to be a couple of like teams that we expected, to be in the mix that are just not at all there,
yeah, and
right?
it's like they could like say for example like say the playoffs like started like right now and everybody who's like the standings are still the same but it's like with a finished record. And, I hate dealing with hypotheticals but it's like we could be in a situation where like 1 through 10 is the same but then like Golden State and Memphis still have great records but they're not going to get in. You know what I mean?
Right.
So that could be a a harsh reality we have to live with.
Right, like that's the difficulty there because again, like the standings obviously are kind of changing around
Sure.
now. But like say like a team like the Rockets, like they were like, I think they were like 5 or 6, like at the start of the podcast, and then
Yeah.
because they lost to, the Bucks, and they dropped down to I think like 8-9. So
Yeah.
now like they're playing team. Um, like that's the crazy part in
Yeah.
the Western Conference is that like again if we look at it right now, right? Minnesota 1, Oklahoma City 2, Dallas 3, Denver 4, Sacramento 5, Clippers 6, Pelicans 7, Lakers 8, Rockets 9, the Suns are 10. Maybe that changes because they just won, I think, against the Wizards, but Warriors 11, then Jazz 12. You'd expect the Grizzlies to probably move up above Utah,
Mm-hmm.
assuming Ja comes back if they can win games. But again, 12 teams that are going to try to vie for 8 spots, that could get really scary, by the
Yeah.
time we get, that play-in spot.
Yep.
Um, then moving on, another team eyeing Anunoby, the Pistons, right? So, that would be kind of wild if Detroit actually ended up trading for a player. I don't know who they would give up in order to get him. I mean,
Yeah, that's just bad. I
yeah,
don't even know what to say to that, honestly. Like that just sounds horrible. I don't know. I wouldn't do that if I was either team.
yeah. So, moving on to the next one. Got some other injury, status updates, I guess. So Bradley Beal, which we hadn't even talked about, since the last time we recorded. But right, they had their first game, with all three guys. Right, they played the Nets. They ended up losing that game. And then they had the second game against the Knicks. And then Bradley Beal, I think in the first quarter, basically, right? I think he played 6 minutes, right? He ended up rolling his ankle, and now he's going to be out, according to Shams, for at least, a few weeks, right? So that obviously means, right, he's probably not going to be back until, sometime, early next year.
You're right.
So, that means we're probably only going to have like 30 odd games, if that, of those three guys playing together. Um, and that's kind of the concern, with the team going into the season was how many games are you going to get of all three guys? That's kind of the issue right now. Um, because now, they were kind of on a good stretch, but then they've lost a couple of games in a row. The defense has slipped. So now they're kind of in a weird spot now where it's like, now Beal's out. I guess you could say like, oh, well, now we're going to play some more defensive guys. But, come playoff time, like you would assume that you need all three guys. So, just kind of just weird. And again, like the Beal thing, it sucks because again, like you gave up stuff to get him, and you're, again, like we talked about Ja. Ja missed 25 games, and after about like a week or so, a week and a half, he's gonna end up playing more games than Beal. So I mean, it's just kind of a brutal thing. Again, we'll see what happens, but I think as long as they have Booker and Durant, they should probably still be fine. But either way, like to be at your best, you probably need all three guys. So it's just kind of been just one of those just weird things where it's like, he missed the early part of the season because of the back. Then he comes back for like a couple games. Then he has back issues flare up again. Then he's out. Then he comes back, and then he, ends up rolling his ankle, and now he's going to be out again. So, that's just kind of just a really rough spot, I think.
Yeah, as a Wizards man, none of that you described or just said surprises me at all. And that's not to like bash him at all. I think he's a great player when he's on the court. Problem is, he's not really going to be on the court. You're not going to get a 70 game season out of the guy ever. I mean, I'm sure he's probably had a couple in his career. I don't know for sure, but with Beal, I remember back in the day when Bleacher Report used to do Game of Zones, the running joke was, yeah, my John Wall would literally tell Bradley Beal, "You're made of glass." Can't remember. It might have been the other way around. But both of them were made of glass at the time.
Yeah.
So regardless, the guy's not durable. So I think Suns fans who are kind of up in arms about this should have probably seen this coming if they did their research. But nonetheless, prayers on that, and I hope he does get better.
Yeah. From, age 19 to 25, right? 56, 73, 63, 55. So early on, he missed some time.
Yeah.
Then the stretch from, 2017, 19, where he had two straight 82 game
Right.
seasons. And then since, that point, right, 57. Now, I think that was the 2019-20, so that was the shortened season, and I'm
Yes.
pretty sure they were in the bubble, if I'm not mistaken,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I guess he probably only missed like, I don't know, 15-ish games.
Yep.
And 2021, 60 games. That was a 72 game season, so he missed, basically 12 games, which is fine.
Yeah.
And then 42 seasons ago, 50 last year, and now he's only played in six.
Yeah.
So,
It's
and
not a
now
great track record.
yeah, and now he's 30, so that's probably not going to change. But again, that was the concern I think going into the season was how many games are we actually going to get of those guys? If
Yeah.
we get, 55 plus games, that's, pretty good. But if we get, like 40 or lower, then that's probably not amazing, right? That's
Right.
kind of, you know, that's probably part of the reason why like they're in the situation where they're in right now, where it's like the record isn't even bad, but it's like, if you had all those guys for most of the games, you'd probably be, top five,
Yeah, they'd have
where
probably 3 less losses.
yeah, whereas now, you're in a spot where it's like, oh, now you have, like you said, three more losses. And every loss, from here on out hurts because it's so close where if you, win a few games, you're going to move up a few spots. But if you lose a
Yeah.
few games, you're going to move down a few spots because everybody's so close. And the last thing you want if you're the Suns is to, be like the team where like the Warriors are the team that kind of rises above you.
Yeah, or you
You know,
don't want to be in the play-in at all. That would be the most expensive play-in
right,
roster of all time.
right. 'Cause that's the other thing, like you said, which is, a good point. If you're trying to be a championship contender, which the Suns, obviously they see themselves as a championship
Heck yeah.
contender, you don't want to be in the play-in, right? Because anything can go wrong, right? You could have a situation where one of those guys gets hurt in the play-in game, and then you lose, right?
Right.
And then all of a sudden your season is done. So, avoid the play-in if you can. It doesn't mean that you can't get out of the conference if you're in the play-in. It just makes it that much harder, which you just don't want. You don't want your path to be, like a ridiculously hard task. Obviously, I mean, you can't, control everything, but ideally, if you're winning a title, you don't want to be in a spot where you're just like, in a rough, spot. You know what I
Right.
mean? So,
Yeah, I get you 100%.
yeah. So, and then, I guess, moving on, right? We already talked about, obviously, some of those other teams, in that trade mix. I already mentioned several teams calling the Warriors, right, according to Woj. We already also heard rumors, according to Yahoo Sports, right, of the Jazz talking about, at one point they were interested in Dame and Drew. I don't know what they would have given up to get him. Maybe marketing, maybe something else like that. But then it's like they're not in a much better spot than they would have been before. So, to me, honestly, like, if you're the Jazz, I just probably wouldn't have done that because I don't think you'd be much better. I mean, I guess you'd be better, but like, how much better? It's like, I don't know. Are you really a contender? Not that that
No.
has to be the goal, but like, I feel like if you're gonna trade for Lillard, you should consider yourself a contender. But
Yeah, they need to commit and figure it out. They either need to commit to being good or they need to commit to tanking and, actually doing a real rebuild. And I think they're trending probably now, realizing that, they're just not good enough to contend, clearly, in probably the next couple of years. So just start the rebuild while you can.
well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know in the comments, your thoughts on, the buyers and sellers. Maybe you think, there's some teams that we probably left out. Maybe you disagree with, what we thought, of some of these teams. We want to hear from you. And, again, we'll shout you out, at the beginning of our, podcast. We're going to start doing that now. It's the 100th episode. So obviously we're, very excited about
Yeah.
that. Here doing 100+ episodes of content. So we appreciate, if you continue to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for all the support and, continue to have, great holidays because the holidays are coming up. The end of the year is coming up, right? So, hopefully we'll also get some great games,
Yeah.
Christmas Day as well. But regardless, we'll see you Friday.